Hello and welcome back to Maryland Men of Faith. So glad that we could spend this time together. Let me ask you something. Do you remember where you were when you heard the news of 9/11 and the attacks that took place on that day? Do you remember where you were when you heard or saw the news of the Challenger, the space Challenger in '87 when it exploded? What about if you are old enough? Do you remember where you were when you heard the news of the assassination of John F. Kennedy? It's interesting that many news that are traumatic or shocking in nature, the memory of where we were and the events surrounding when we heard that news stay with us really for the rest of our lives. I think of a news that David received that the emotional memory would have been with him for the rest of his life. And it was the news about hearing about the death of Saul and Jonathan. In the book of 2 Samuel, it records that news when David received it. You know that David had been anointed to become king, but it took some nearly 20 years before he could actually be crowned king. David was operating on God's timing, and even if he had an opportunity to do something to sort of rush along God's promise in his life, David knew that the best thing for him was to trust that God would bring his promise to fulfillment at the right time and in the right way. I'd like to share with you, based on some scriptures from 2 Samuel, really things that speak to us about three keys to developing character, especially as men. Character when it comes to the workplace, character in our relationships, marriages, character as fathers, if you happen to be fathers, and every responsibility and relationship in life. These three characters are keys to becoming men of integrity and becoming, as David was, a man after God's own heart. And those three keys is, first off, that David trusted God's timing. The second key is that he trusted and he looked through God's perspective. And then the third is that he upheld God's honor. So the first one with God's timing, the story records that when an Amalekite came to tell David the news, and his account was that he had killed Saul because Saul had asked him to drive his sword through him. The man was probably wanting to be ingratiating himself to David, but David was not flattered or impressed in any way. He did not want anybody taking the king's life. Can you believe that? David would not become king in any man-made fashion. He was going to wait on God's timing. Notice here, I'm reading from 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 12. It says, "They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword." David had in his mind God's perspective about the events that had taken place. You know, Israel was in special need of healing from the wounds and the afflictions of war. Their king had just been slain, and you can imagine the drop in morale. But David's weeping and his mourning was not simply of a personal nature for Saul and for Jonathan. He didn't only weep for them, but it says that he wept for the army of the Lord and for the nation of Israel. So David's perspective was much bigger than his own feelings. That is the second key, is cultivating God's perspective in how we see things and how we deal with things. That there is a much bigger strategy at play than simply that which affects us personally. And then the third key to character is that David upheld God's honor. God's honor was upheld when David asked the Amalekite, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Gentlemen, I don't know how it is, Perhaps in each of our lives, we are confronted with choices and decisions where we wonder about what may be best for me, what is for my best interest. David's best interest, or David's mindset, was only for that which would uphold God's honor. Can you imagine David, who on 2 occasions had an opportunity to slay Saul, would ask this man, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" David made sure that Saul would not be prematurely killed in any way so that he can become king. And so those are the 3 keys that I'd like to leave with you, that we can learn from the life and the experiences of David. Wherever you are today, that you would remember that God's timing is perfect, and that we ought to wait and to see how God maneuvers circumstances in his right time and in his right way. And also that we would look through God's perspective at things, that we back up and see that the affairs taking place and notice that it has much greater effects than simply things for myself or my circle, but there is a perspective much bigger. And then the third thing is that upholding God's honor is the first and foremost in our decision making and how we go about life. I hope that where you are today in life, that you would be encouraged by the story of David, and that these 3 keys for character building would be in your life and mine. God bless you until we see you again from Maryland Men of Faith.